Welcome to today's webinar, NFPA 80, Inspection, Testing, and Maintenance of Swinging Fire Doors. This webinar is sponsored by the Door and Hardware Institute. The Door and Hardware Institute is the only professional association dedicated to the architectural openings industry. With the purpose of advancing life safety and security within the built environment, DHI represents the North American openings marketplace as the advocate and primary resource for information, professional development, and certification. At DHI, we educate, advocate, and facilitate for the industry. The Door Security and Safety Foundation offers individuals and organizations the opportunity to learn and experience the vital role that the architectural opening plays in life safety and security. The Foundation's ongoing objectives include raising awareness, supplying education and research, and providing outreach programs to those in need. For more than 100 years, Intertek has served as the testing, inspection, and certification leader for the building's products and materials. Intertek's Warnock-Hersey mark has long been the industry's preferred certification mark. After DHI training is complete, Intertek certifies, inspects, and issues them a Certified Fire Egress Door Inspector badge, valid for 3 years. This is recognized by authorities having jurisdiction, and they know these individuals are certified to properly perform the annual inspections as required by NFPA 80 and NFPA 101. Your presenters today will be Kristen Bigda. Kristen is a fire protection engineer in the NFPA Building Fire Protection and Life Safety Department and serves as staff liaison to several safety to life and building code technical committees. Kristen also assists in the development of NFPA 1 fire code and other documents pertaining to the fire doors and windows, contents and furnishings, and fire risk assessment methods. Prior to joining NFPA staff in 2007, Kristen attended Warsaw Polytechnics Institute, where she received degrees of Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineer and Masters of Science in Fire Protection Engineering. Kristen is also a registered professional engineer in the discipline of fire protection in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Keith Peridot is the Director of Education and Technical Services for the Door and Hardware Institute. Keith oversees the development of DHI's curriculum and professional certification program. Keith entered the architectural door industry in the mid-1980s. He became an architectural hardware consultant in 1991 and a certified door consultant in 1994. In 2004, Keith received DHI's Distinguished Honors Award for his technical expertise. In 2007, Keith led the development of DHI's Fire Door Assembly Inspection Program for the inspection of swinging fire doors with builders' hardware. Currently, Keith is a principal member of the NFPA FDA AAA Technical Committee that is responsible for the development of NPA 80 and NFPA 105. Due to time constraints, we will not be taking any questions during today's webinar. My name is Lori Gonzalez, and I will be your moderator for this session. With that, I will pass the presentation over to Kristen.
Thank you, Lori. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Again, as Lori mentioned, the webinar is on the inspection, testing, and maintenance of swinging fire doors. My name is Kristen Bigda from NFPA, and I will be presenting with Keith Peridot from the Door and Hardware Institute. And with that, I will turn it over to Keith to get us started.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us. And in addition to the comments that Lori offered, we have a great deal of information to cover in just a short period of time. Here's the agenda for our presentation this afternoon. And because of the time constraints, we're just not able to address your questions and give them a thorough and considered response. So what we'll do later, and you'll hear me mention this a little bit later in the presentation, hold your questions, write them down as you think about them, and hold your questions. I'll be giving you some information later on in the presentation about a LinkedIn discussion group that the Door and Hardware Institute started earlier this year. And we can continue this discussion offline in that forum. So I know it's a little awkward maybe for the time being, but just as you think about the questions, go ahead and make note of them, write them down. We can discuss them much better, much more thoroughly in the other forum. Plus, always, if you have a question, if you think of a particular question, somebody else in the audience is probably has that same question or one very similar to it, and we can build a good conversation over there and address your questions. Today's topic, obviously, is the inspection requirements NFPA 80. And hopefully, I think right before the meeting, the last day or so, you received an email from NFPA that has the presentation, the handout, copies of these slides available to you. Hopefully you've printed them out. You might find it helpful to make some notes on your hard copy as we go through. But what we're talking about today is the safety inspections of fire door assemblies, and why is it necessary, why is it important? And we've got a couple pictures here at the beginning of the presentation to give it a little bit of context and maybe help you visualize why safety inspections are necessary. If you look at the door on your screen and look at it closely, look at the picture. Above the door you can see a darkened area. You can see where perhaps flames and definitely smoke have escaped around the top of the door, but look at the floor too. You can see the floor is discolored from the heat of the fire and probably from the water used to extinguish the fire. Now, keep that picture in the back of your mind, or again, if you have the handouts printed out, look at that picture. But the very next picture that we're going to look at is the other side of that very same door. Notice the difference. You can see that the room was destroyed by fire. The door on this side of the opening looks much different than it does from the corridor side. Fire doors and the related construction, the wall construction, the floor construction, the ceiling construction, are all types of passive fire protection. But they're only as good and reliable as the products that are used to make those assemblies. The safety inspections that we're going to talk about this afternoon go to the very point that all of the products involved need to be the appropriate product to make sure that the door assemblies are able to perform their job. I mean, if you just flip back and forth between these two pictures, you can see that there's a very stark difference between the fire side of the door assembly and the non-fire side of the door assembly. So keep these pictures in the back of your mind and maybe refer to them as we go through the presentation. It helps you understand the level of importance that fire door assemblies play in protecting us in our buildings every day. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Kristen, and I'll be back and talk to you a little bit later.
Thanks, Keith. Again, thank you, everyone. Like you heard Lori mention in the beginning, during the introduction portion, I am the NFPA staff liaison for the Fire Door and Window Technical Committee. That committee has responsibility for the development and publication of NFPA 80, which we're all here to learn about today, as well as NFPA 105 for the protection of smoke door assemblies. So what I'm going to talk about with you all for the next several minutes is some of the sort of critical and important requirements in NFPA 80 that are related to the inspection, testing, and maintenance criteria that both Keith and I are going to be talking about throughout the program today. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes kind of giving you the code perspective And then Keith will take over sort of talking about some of the field-related issues and additional offerings related to inspection, testing, and maintenance of these fire doors. I want to talk a little bit sort of about the history of NFPA 80 with regards to care and maintenance. First off, Keith and myself will be spending our presentation today making reference to the 2010 edition of NFPA 80, which is, I'll say it's the current edition, but it won't be the current edition for long. The 2013 edition of NFPA 80 should actually be available for purchase within the next few weeks or so, which is, an exciting time whenever we are able to release a new edition of this standard. Our technical committee spent the past couple of years attending their revision meetings for the development of this new edition 2013. However, with how code adoption works and how our model building codes like NFPA 5000, our Life Safety Code, NFPA 101, International Building Code, those are our larger codes that reference specifically the use of NFPA 80. And because of sort of how, again, code adoption works, there's sort of a lag in the adoption process, our model building codes are just getting to referencing the 2010 edition. Many codes and many jurisdictions are still on the 2007. So we felt that it was important to still highlight sort of where most of our audience is at today, and that's really the 2010 edition, if not, again, 2007. But in order to understand these requirements, we sort of need to understand, where we've been in the past and sort of where we're going in the future. Prior to 2007, and you'll hear me reference that particular edition of NFPA 80 quite a bit, because the 2007 edition went through some pretty large technical as well as editorial changes. It was essentially a complete rewrite from the previous edition of the document, which was 1999. Significant technical changes, additions in the document for new topics that weren't covered in the past. And one of the biggest technical changes that occurred for the 2007 edition was related specifically to the inspection, testing, and maintenance of fire doors. Prior to 2007, the edition prior to that was 1999. And what I'm showing you here on this slide is how the 1999 edition of our document actually dealt with the inspection, testing, and maintenance of fire doors. And what it said was simply that hardware shall be examined frequently, and any parts found to be inoperative shall be replaced immediately. So with that, it was really sort of the building owners and the authority having jurisdictions sort of responsibility to identify, well, what is that, how frequently does that really mean? Or when something is not working on that fire door, or when it's damaged, or when I need to replace a component, how quickly do I need to replace that? The language was just, it was not enforceable. It was not good code language, and it was not providing the guidance to, again, our building owners and building management, our authorities having jurisdiction on what we need to do to actually keep our openings safe in our buildings. And those two pictures that Keith showed you in the beginning are really sort of a great introduction to everything we have to talk about today, and sort of the purpose for why we're all here is to learn about what we can do to make sure that a fire door in our building acts as it was tested to, acts as it was intended to protect our building and our occupants in our building as well. So the committee said, we need to do something about this. We're really not addressing this topic, adequately enough in our standard. We need to develop the inspection, testing, and maintenance criteria a little bit further, and they did do that. Now you'll find in the standard, again, this was new for 2007, but we're continuing to build on this concept throughout 2013, is there is an entire chapter dedicated to the care and maintenance or inspection, testing, and maintenance of our fire doors. And it builds upon that concept that was there very vaguely in 1999. And it has been expanded to, include much more detail regarding inspection, testing, and maintenance of fire doors, requirements for repairs, field modifications, inspections, again, our annual testing, and maintenance requirements for fire door assemblies. In particular, I'm going to talk about sort of what that large change was in just a couple of slides. Before I talk anything more about our care and maintenance provisions, one particularly important sort of code application item that we need to understand is that Chapter 5 is applicable to new and existing installations. So if we take one step back a little bit, NFPA 80 sort of in general, the requirements of 80 are not intended to be applied to structure, buildings or installations prior to the effective date of the document. So this NFPA 80 is really applicable to new installations only. However, with specific regard to Chapter 5, there's a section right in the very front of that chapter that tells me as a user of the document that the requirements of Chapter 5 shall apply to new and existing installations. So this is now going to apply when we start talking about the details in Chapter 5 with regard, again, to inspection, testing, and maintenance. This is going to apply to new construction. It's also going to apply to my existing buildings as well, and that's important, again, based upon what building code you're using when you're enforcing a building. If you're a building owner, a building manager, some sort of safety personnel of an existing building today, these are all going to be applicable to you, and it really is important to understand what this chapter applies to before we even start getting into what some of those requirements are. So what's this big change that we're all talking about? What's really the reason that we're all here today? This is the new requirement, again, that came into 2007, and this requirement now tells me that fire door assemblies shall be inspected and tested not less than annually, and a written record of the inspection shall be signed and kept for inspection by the authority having jurisdiction. So I just kind of want to talk about this for a couple minutes. Obviously, this is probably one of the biggest technical changes that occurred, in the development of NFPA 80 over the past, past few editions. The concept of requiring an annual inspection actually put a frequency on, it was able to quantify how these inspections have to be conducted. It went from that word, frequently and quickly and immediately to actually saying not less than annually. And, this requirement has sort of put into light the attention that we have to give to our opening protectives in our buildings to making sure that they're, being maintained in working condition, that they're going to sort of serve their purpose, if that building, were to have a fire. So that's really where, this webinar has come from, is as our, the newer editions of building codes are being adopted by jurisdictions and by states and by organizations. We're seeing this annual inspection requirement sort of being spread out, throughout the country, throughout those that are using NFPA 80, and it's really becoming an important procedure that must be, that, the building owners, authorities having jurisdiction, fire door inspectors have to be aware of. And like I just mentioned, this requirement does affect sort of all three categories of users that we sort of talked about before, that Keith is going to talk about later on. So building owners and property managers must be aware of the inspection requirements and ensure that the door assemblies in their respective buildings are being inspected and that those inspections are being scheduled at proper intervals. Fire door inspectors, which is sort of a new audience that has come out of this requirement now, because we need to make sure that we have this group of individuals or organizations that have the level of knowledge and understanding of how these doors work, what their components are, what the hardware is, that will be available to sort of conduct these inspections in various buildings and situations. And then in addition, sort of our third audience of users that's affected by this requirement is our authorities having jurisdiction. Our AHJs must review the inspection reports, be aware of their inspection reports, ask for the inspection reports, and ensure that the inspections are being completed on time, and that they're aware of what Chapter 5 tells them and that they're enforcing the appropriate provisions in Chapter 5. Before we get into some of the specific details, two types of testing and inspection are required. We kind of refer to them as functional testing versus visual inspections. Functional testing, is a door in working condition? When I open the door, does it close completely? Is it working as it should on a day-to-day basis? And the visual inspection is really just that. By looking at the opening, looking at the door and its hardware and its components, are all the pieces there? Is anything broken? Does anything look like it might be installed incorrectly? Are there any items on the fire door that aren't part of the rated assembly or that could potentially void the rated assembly? All of those, those things need to be taken into consideration when conducting these functional tests and visual inspections. Before we actually get into the requirements for Chapter 5, there's sort of this hidden requirement at the very end of Chapter 4 of the 2010 and 2007 editions of NFPA 80. And this actually requires that a test be done, a sort of a functional test and visual inspection be completed on a fire door assembly once the fire door has been installed. So in this case, for new installations, upon completion of installation, we do need to verify that the door is in working conditions. Verify that there's no floor coverings that could be preventing the door from closing. There's no obstructions to the opening, and that it has been installed properly. Once that particular test has been completed, and that a written record has been complete to document that this initial test has been done, then we're going to assume that your door is good to go and it's functioning and that it's going to be protecting that opening. And then after that, we need to make sure that, like we showed you a couple slides back, that on that annual basis our buildings are completing the annual inspection of our fire doors. We have that initial test upon completion of installation. Then after that, NFPA 80 requires our fire doors to be inspected and tested not less than annually. What I'm going to do here for the next few slides is just go over some of the specific code requirements and sort of details that NFPA 80 requires for these annual inspections. And what I've done really is taken this language that you see on the slides directly from the code. This particular program that Keith and I are talking about today deals specifically with swinging doors with builder's hardware. If you do have NFPA 80 with you today, or if you're going to be going back to that standard after today's presentation, we have done our best to include some section references in there for you. So if we're talking about a particular issue and you are wondering, well, where in the document can I find that? We have included that in some of the details that we're going to talk about. So what I want to talk about now is a list of about 11 items that NFPA 80 expects at a minimum be verified during these annual inspections. And again, I kind of want to emphasize that word minimum. This list is by no means inclusive of every single fire door installation. It's really there as sort of a starting point for building owners to be aware of, fire door inspectors to be aware of, HJs to be aware of. Just again to kind of give you a good overall list of components that should be verified during that visual inspection. What we've done again is just sort of listed those 11 items individually here to really understand what NFPA 80 is looking for and what fire door inspectors should be looking for during their inspection. Some of these list items are quite obvious, but they are so important that if we overlook them, we actually could be jeopardizing how that fire door is going to protect our opening. So the first item that we're asking you to look at during the fire door inspections is simply that to verify that no open holes or breaks exist in surfaces of either the door or the frame. Something like a hole or a break in the door, essentially it severs the continuity of the fire resistance rated barrier that it's protecting. So we all know that if we have a fire door in our building, that fire door is there because there is an opening for functional purposes in a fire resistance rated assembly. Things like stair enclosures, corridors, hazardous area protection. These are areas in our building, could be building separation, occupancy separation. These are areas in our building that by either a building code or a life safety code, we're required to have a fire resistance rating. But obviously for, again, the day-to-day functions of a building, we need things like doors and windows in those walls for people to move throughout the building and whatnot. So in order to sort of maintain that continuity of that fire resistance barrier, we then have to install these fire protection rated opening protectives. Obviously today we're talking about doors. So anything like a hole or a break in that fire door assembly would actually void the continuity that we've achieved by installing that fire door. And as soon as we void that continuity, we can pretty much say that we've voided the fire resistance rating of that barrier because it's not going to serve the purpose of providing a continuous separation or compartmentation in my building. The next item that we want to look at is to ensure that glazing, vision light panels, and glazing beads are intact and securely fastened in place if so equipped. And I do want to point out on your slide that you see on your computer right now, in some of these items, we've actually included sort of a parenthetical reference that shows you where in NFPA 80 is sort of the base requirements regarding, in this particular issue, glazing, for example. So to look for all of the documents requirements for glazing installation, you can go back to section 4.4 of your code, of your standard. Now, why it's important to ensure that our glazing is, in many fire doors have fire protection or fire resistance glazing in them, to ensure that the glazing itself is securely intact in the door, so that if that door is to be exposed to fire conditions, that glazing panel or that vision panel is not actually going to fall out of our door and create an opening in our door that's going to expose multiple fire compartments to the fire conditions. So we need to ensure that they're installed properly, they're fastened in their frame, there's no breaks or anything, any damage to the glazing, again, to ensure that it all stays as one assembly under all fire conditions. Number 3, the door, frame, hinges, hardware, and non-combustible threshold are secured, aligned, and in working order with no visible signs of damage. For additional details on fire door frames and swinging fire door assembly components, you can refer to 631 or 6.4 of the document. Now, this is important in particular from a visual aspect to ensure that doors, first off, are properly aligned in their frame, again, to ensure that we have a continuous and effective fire resistant or fire barrier. If those doors maybe weren't installed properly, if they've been exposed to damage, if you've had a cart or items that have sort of banged up against the fire door and now they're not aligned in their frame, that could actually increase sort of the gaps in the fire door and the frame, could be in excess of what the standard requires. And we're going to, again, void essentially the rating of that door if we're going to be, if it's not going to be installed properly. And this is something that could happen over time. That could happen in particular in doors that in high traffic areas that see a lot of use. It's important to identify, again, that everything is in line. There's no damage in the door or the frame that might affect how it closes, how it operates. Again, with that common theme of ensuring that it's closed and protected at the time of fire. Pretty obvious one here. Verify that no parts are missing or broken. What you can actually see here on your screen is an example of a hinge that is missing, missing some pieces. And how often do we pass through fire door openings? And even without realizing that we were looking for deficiency, I know when I'm on the road a lot for work, we all too often see fire door assemblies that are missing pieces, missing parts of the closer, the door closer that might not ensure the door closes properly, missing parts like you see here. It could be missing pins or screws or components of the hardware, the latching devices. And missing parts can pretty much guarantee that the door will not operate properly during an emergency, and that's what we're trying to avoid by conducting these visual inspections. Probably one of the most questioned or one of the most frequent deficiencies that we see in fire door installations is with regards to door clearances. So we're going to remind you during that visual inspection to ensure that door clearances at the door edge to the frame on the pull side of the door do not exceed those clearances listed in section 484 of NFPA 80 as well as section 6317. Now, section 484 is sort of that base requirement that tells me that the clearance under the bottom of my fire door cannot exceed 3/4 of an inch. So that's sort of the first measurement we need to keep in mind when doing that visual inspection. The other measurement is what you see here, and this is going to be sort of our vertical or clearances, or our clearances between the door and the frame. And NFPA 80 is going to say that that cannot exceed 1/8 of an inch. So you're going to take your little measurement tool or whatever you have and verify that that 3/4 of an inch and that 1/8 of an inch clearance is compliant and that it does not exceed that issue. Now I get, and I think Keith is going to talk about this a little bit more as well, but I do get many questions from NFPA customers and NFPA 80 users asking how we fix the clearances in the fire door. They get to a fire door assembly and the clearance does not meet what NFPA 80 states as the acceptable clearance requirements. For the most part, NFPA 80 only offers one solution in the document, to help doors not meeting the clearance requirements. And that's really in Chapter 6 where we do permit shimming of steel hinges to meet that 1/8 of an inch clearance requirement. But for the most part, any additional hardware or items that you want to install in the fire door are not compliant with NFPA 80. Now, certainly you have that clause up back in Chapter 1 that allows the authority having jurisdiction to grant equivalency for different installations and combinations of installations. That's okay. But for the most part, NFPA 80 does not say this is what you can do if you have an issue with a clearance other than shimming hinges. So if you're looking for that, we do not offer sort of exceptions to that rule in the code. Number 6, the self-closing device is operational. That is, the active door completely closes when operated from the fully open position. Now, closing devices are one of the most important components to a fire door assembly. If a door does not close properly, the opening protective has not done its job of protecting the opening in the fire resistance rated barrier. Doors must be closed and latched to provide continuous passive fire protection in the building during a fire. Now, of course, special permission, is given for some doors to be automatic closing. I see things like corridor doors, for example, they're not always going to be closed, but they are going to be permitted to be held open with a compliant hold open device. That, upon activation of a smoke detector in that area tends to close the doors and protect the opening, and that's okay. But it's imperative that the door closing device, again, is installed properly. It contains all of its parts. It's not missing any pieces. It's actually attached where it needs to be attached. I've seen quite a few doors, again, in my travels where the closing device has been there, but it actually hasn't been attached to, the door and the frame, and the doors, it might as well not be there. And again, ensure that that device can actually close the door properly at the appropriate speed. NFPA 80 actually does not mandate a minimum or maximum closing speed for fire doors, but that is something you'd probably want to just verify that if the door was closing very, very, very quickly, it actually could potentially be dangerous or hazardous to occupants that are using that door, or if the door was closing so slowly that it really wouldn't be affected by the time it closed the opening. So there's some judgment needed there along with all of these items. Number 7, if a coordinator is installed, the inactive leaf closes before the active leaf. And again, there's some additional requirements in Section 6412 for coordinating devices. We see the use of coordinating devices again when you have a pair of door leaves, either where one of them is required for egress, where both doors are required for egress. The point here is if you have a pair of door leaves and you have a coordinator, that coordinator is doing its job, meaning that it's not closing the doors or in the incorrect order such that the active leaf, it might get sort of stuck on the inactive leaf, or if they're both being used, that one of the door leaves doesn't completely shut all the way, and then you essentially have a large gap between your doors, and you don't have a protected opening. So a coordinator is great. It's useful for pairs of doors, but it can actually be dangerous or hazardous if it's not installed properly because the doors aren't going to close and latch for fire conditions. Number 8, latching hardware. Ensure that it operates and secures the door when it is in the closed position. So two of the words you've heard me use quite often so far is this closed and latched, closed and latched. Doors must achieve positive latching when closed and latched during fire conditions. So, what is this thing called positive latching? Positive latching is when a door is latched and it's sort of held closed or held in that latched position with such a force that under fire conditions that door is not going to blow open and expose that opening and expose multiple fire compartments. So we want to ensure that not only is that door latched, but it's latched and it's going to hold closed under fire conditions. NFPA 80 covers various latching hardware arrangements. Hardware should be properly listed or labeled according to the requirements of the standard. And we should ensure that fire exit hardware, if installed, is installed on fire-rated doors that bear a label permitting that fire door to be equipped with fire exit hardware. And fire exit hardware is simply panic hardware that has been tested for use on fire protection rated doors. So in places like assembly occupancies, schools that actually mandate the use of panic hardware, if you have a fire protection rated door, we refer to that in NFPA 80 as fire exit hardware. Number 9, auxiliary hardware items that interfere or prohibit operation are not installed on the door or frame. Just in my experience, this is probably one of the most, or one of the items on this list that is violated most frequently. And this little picture that you see here is probably the culprit of those violations, and that is your kickstops. Kickstops are directly in violation of this particular item and in direct violation of the concept that doors must close and latch upon fire. Your kickstops are NFPA 80 does not rely on us or rely on human intervention to sort of help us close those doors upon fire conditions. So installing a kickstop on your door is essentially going to mean that a person has to come up to that fire door, release the kickstop, and allow the door to close at that time, and we're just not going to allow that to happen. Now, one particular section I want to make reference to here, Section 5152 for field modification. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. So item number 10 tells me that no field modifications to the door assembly have been performed that void the label. Section 5152 is a direct reference back to the requirements for field modifications. So field modifications not addressed by the standard or not permitted by the standard by NFPA 80 most likely will void the label of the fire door. So back in Chapter 4, NFPA 80 has a section called appurtenances. And this particular section actually gives us some items or some actions that can be taken to a fire door without it being considered a field modification. Once you start performing or doing something to a fire door, whether or not it be a new installation or an existing installation, that is not how that door was tested or installed, chances are you have a field modification. And NFPA 80 actually requires that if you do have a field modification, you actually have to contact the laboratory whose label is on that door and sort of verify the modification that you're looking to do. And the reason why we require this is because most of these modifications that people are doing without being aware of the function of the door, of the hardware of the door, that is even a fire protection rated door, are probably going to void the label on that door. And there's a label on fire doors that tells us it has been tested to the appropriate standards, it has been given a specific fire protection rating, and if we go sort of beyond that label and beyond how that door was tested, we can't guarantee that that door is going to perform in the way that it was tested. Field modifications can be a very serious issue with fire door assemblies today. Finally, gasketing and edge seals, where required, are inspected to verify their presence and integrity. And again, Section 648 deals with gasketing. Very quickly, I just want to talk about this concept of a performance-based option. There is a section in the code that deals with performance-based fire door inspections. If you have sort of a building like you see here of a very large casino that could have hundreds upon hundreds of fire doors, and it's just not practical to complete that door inspection on an annual basis, the code says you can modify that annual frequency by either mandating a more frequent inspection schedule or a less frequent inspection schedule. If you sort of present the data, the historical information, the reasoning why you wish to modify the annual frequency, and the authority having jurisdiction then grants permission to alter that frequency. If you do deal with that, again, that's back in Chapter 5. We just don't have too much time to spend on that today. Also, very quickly, I wanted to highlight just a couple of other pieces that are covered in Chapter 5, in particular repairs. Simply put, if you have something on your fire door that needs to be repaired, the repair must be fixed immediately, and then the door must be tested to ensure that it's working. Once you've made the repair, does the door work? Does the component look to be in working condition, and the repair appear to be successful? That's also in Chapter 5. Also, again, field modifications, already just talked about those. If you're taking notes here, they're covered in Section 515, and it tells us specifically what we have to do if we look to make a field modification to our door. Finally, documentation that you already heard me mention once. For that initial test, documentation is also required where written during annual inspections, any performance-based inspections, maintenance of closing mechanisms, and again, the initial testing of the fire door assembly. He has to provide documentation and has to be available for the authority having jurisdiction when they do confirm those inspections. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Keith.
All right, well, thank you, Kristen. Next, we're going to talk about roles and responsibilities. And Kristen touched on this earlier, that we have three main groups of people. We have the building owners, we have the authorities having jurisdiction, and we have the inspectors. And they each have a very clear and distinct role in the inspection and performing NFPA 80 safety inspections of fire door assemblies. Primarily, it's the building owner's responsibility, whether it's through a property management company or direct employees of the building owner. These door assemblies are part of the built structure, and it's necessary for them to be properly maintained. The problem is a lot of building owners and property managers never were really told how to properly maintain their fire door assemblies. And today's subject, we're specifically talking about swinging fire doors with builder's hardware. And I'll elaborate on that in just a little bit, but because there are other types of fire door assemblies, all equally important in protecting the structure and the occupants of the structure. But the building owners need to understand what they can do to a fire door assembly and what they can't do to a fire door assembly. And they need to be aware of, obviously, the requirement to do the inspections. So making the building owners aware of these responsibilities is part of the role of the DHI Foundation that you heard mentioned at the top of the program. We'll come back and talk about that in just a moment too. You can see on the screen there are a couple of things here. They've got to, the owner personnel need to be aware of the limitations, and the inspections need to be properly documented, and that's going to be a key component going forward here. Now, the authorities having jurisdiction, the code enforcement people, regardless of what their titles might be, they are the people, the men and women charged with enforcing the applicable building requirements, building code requirements. Their role is to make sure that the fire door assemblies, in this case, are being properly maintained. And it's really important to understand, Kristen mentioned it earlier too, working condition. We're not talking about maintaining the doors in like new condition. That's not a requirement. They have to be functional. They don't have to be pretty, but they do have to be functional. The authorities having jurisdiction periodically inspect existing buildings to make sure that they are properly being maintained in accordance with whatever the applicable codes are in that region. Clearances around the perimeter of door openings is probably going to be the #1 headache in all of these inspections. There was a slide earlier that Kristen showed you, the 1/8 inch clearance around the perimeter of the doors. And not to get too technical, but for wood fire doors, it's 1/8 of an inch maximum clearance on the sides and across the top, and between meeting styles of doors, pairs of doors. And for hollow metal doors, it's 1/8 of an inch plus or minus a 1/16. It can be as small as a 1/16 of an inch, but it can be no greater than 3/16 of an inch. Those dimensions, actually, the 1/8 inch dimension comes directly from the actual fire door test. In this case, NFPA 252, which is the prevailing fire door test that NFPA 80 is based on. But we also have fire door tests from Underwriters Laboratories, UL 10B and UL 10C. So but when you look at all of these fire door tests, they are designed around a maximum of 1/8 inch clearance for fire door assemblies. So that's really where it comes from. Now, replicating that in the field is not impossible, but it can be at times very difficult to do. And one of the problems that we often see is if the frames are not properly anchored to the wall over time, they are going to move. And the doors will become out of alignment, whether it's a single door in a three-sided frame or a pair of doors. And there's a picture coming up later that will help illustrate what we're talking about. The AHJ's role then is also just to make determination within their jurisdiction how these inspections are going to be enforced. We have clearances. How are they going to handle the clearances? We just talked about some of the problems with the clearances. Labels on doors or frames that have been painted over. There is a lot of critical information recorded on those labels. When it is concealed by paint, you don't know exactly what type of fire door you have. You know it's a fire door, but you don't know how long it was tested for. You don't know if it's got special requirements. There's information lost. Grace periods for making corrective actions. Some, NFPA 80, and we talked about it earlier, without delay. Repairs have to be made without delay. But in some cases, especially in the case where you have to replace a door leaf, it might take several weeks to order a door to fit the opening. So there has to be some expectation of time allowed to perform the corrective actions. The other consideration the AHJs will need to address, especially in today's economic times, frankly, is the cost. There is a cost associated with making repairs and bringing these door assemblies up to the NFPA 80 requirements. So those are other considerations that not easy we can't easily sit here and say, well, this is the way it's going to be. Each AHJ's office is going to have to determine how to go forward with these inspections in their regions. The fire door assembly inspector's role, basically, as you see here, to witness, document, and report. They're not enforcing code requirements. They are not acting on behalf of the AHJ. They are not the agent of the AHJ going out and threatening punitive actions or fines or anything of that nature. They are simply working with the building owners, making the building owner aware of the condition of the fire door assemblies in that structure as of the date and time of that inspection. Anything can happen after the inspection is done. If you have a fire door assembly that is today compliant, but tomorrow something, let's say it's in a warehouse, it gets struck by a fork truck. Obviously, the inspector has no foreknowledge of something that might happen. So, today that opening is compliant. That's all that we can do. That's the best that we can do is make sure as of today what are the conditions of the fire door assemblies. Now, you see the bullet point about research and document special conditions. There are different types of fire door assemblies. You have fire door assemblies that bear a label that says the door has been tested to whatever requirements. But occasionally, a door that is larger than typical is required. And there is a limit to the size, to the maximum overall size of a door that can actually be tested in the furnaces at the testing labs. When the door leaf exceeds that size, that maximum size, it'll have something called a construction label, or perhaps a certificate of construction. That is basically saying that that door is built the same as a door that was tested, but it has something different about it. Maybe a different hardware application that's a larger door. There's something that has not been actually tested. Engineering-wise, it meets the same criteria as the doors that were tested. But all of that information needs to be documented in that initial inspection so that in future years when these inspections are performed, that research is already done. That opening more than likely is not going to change from year to year to year. The fire door assemblies inspectors need to be able to recommend what corrective actions are necessary. And we'll talk about some specific recommendations in a little bit. You'll find out that the majority of corrective actions really require very little expense, a little bit of labor, a little bit of time maybe, but very little out-of-pocket expense. And we'll talk about some of those repairs in a little bit. But the AHJ or the inspectors, the door assembly inspectors, need to be able to make recommendations so that the owner's personnel or whoever is going to be doing the work understands what they can do and what they can't do to those fire door assemblies. The fire door assemblies inspectors are also going to play an education role. Somebody needs to help teach the building owners and their personnel what they can and can't do with fire door assemblies. AHJs need to understand, too, the complexity of some of these door assemblies. Well, I'll come back to that point in just a moment. I've got some good examples that we'll talk about in just a moment. Okay, so performing. Now, one of the main distinctions that you need to understand when we're talking about swinging fire doors with builder's hardware, the label on the door applies only to the door leaf itself. It doesn't cover any of the testing of the other components of the door opening. A swinging fire door with builder's hardware is a component-based system. The frame might come from one manufacturer, the door leaf from another manufacturer, and the hardware components from several manufacturers. Within all of those different components, you might have a product that's tested by or each of the products might be tested by different testing organizations. So not only are the components individually labeled, they might be labeled by different testing organizations. That's permissible under NFPA 80. We don't have time to dig into all of the specific references, but understand that it is permissible to have that type of door assembly. In fact, the majority of installed swinging fire doors with builder's hardware are comprised of multiple components from different testing organizations. It's just the way that these door systems have been brought to market ever since the beginning. Each component, the key you need to remember is each component is required to be labeled or listed for use on fire door assemblies. Now, the check mark that you see on your screen, the label of the door establishes the fire rating of the entire opening. And typically, for instance, you might have a frame that's capable of being installed in a 3-hour fire-rated door assembly. It's a 16-gauge hollow metal frame, for instance, installed in a masonry block wall. But the door might be a 20-minute wood door, might be a 45-minute steel door or hollow metal door, might be a 90-minute door. The component with the least amount of fire protection rating is what sets the fire protection rating for the entire assembly. So always understand that. And that, again, is why it's important to be able to read those labels. If the labels are painted over, then you don't know exactly what the rating of the door is supposed to be. Very, very essential to understand that. Now, I mentioned earlier that there are other types of fire door assemblies, and when you read NFPA 80, if you've never opened NFPA 80, you really should take time. It's not a very long document, page-wise, but it is a very technical and detailed document. And you can see on the screen a list of different types of door assemblies. Each of these door assemblies are as critical to protecting the structure, the built structure, as swinging doors with builder's hardware. Swinging doors with builder's hardware, swinging fire doors with builder's hardware, are probably the most common type of fire door assembly, but there are some buildings where you have very few swinging fire doors with builder's hardware, but you might have a lot of rolling steel fire doors or horizontally sliding fire doors. So there really are, even though we're talking today about swinging fire doors with builder's hardware, NFPA 80's inspection requirements apply to all of the fire door assemblies covered in NFPA 80. Now, there are a couple chapters that have their own specific requirements that are not applicable in Chapter 5, but all of the fire door assemblies have inspection requirements. Now, here's a list of just some of the typical combinations of products that are used to form swinging fire doors with builder's hardware. These are just the doors and frames. Now, you might have frames that are sidelight frames or transom frames. You can have a frame that is a very long frame with multiple door openings in it. You can have a bank of doors that have door openings in it, or a long door frame that has multiple pairs of doors, for instance, side by side throughout the length of the frame. There are lots of different configurations that are out there. Now, when we talk about inspecting the function of swinging fire doors, Kristen mentioned it, and it's worth, she mentioned that latching and closing, or closing and latching in that order specifically, is the primary test, and that's absolutely true. But in the case of swinging fire doors with builder's hardware, we have to remember that each component installed on that door assembly needs to have its own individual label. There are types of latching devices that are not fire rated. There are types of hinges that are not fire rated. There are types of door closers that aren't appropriate for use on fire door assemblies. It takes a person with a lot of component-based knowledge, a lot of expertise, to be able to walk up to a door assembly and evaluate it quickly and accurately. The primary test of closing and latching is very easy to understand. What's more difficult to understand is it the right latching device? Are the right type of hinges or pivots being used? Is there anything else in the door assembly that either is required to be there that's not there, or is there something on the door assembly that really shouldn't be there because it's not fire rated? So it takes a great deal of knowledge to be able to understand, evaluate these doors. The last bullet point is that some building owners will just operate under the assumption that, the HJ comes in here every couple years, and they check all of the fire doors every time. That's probably not true. They might check a couple fire doors here or there, the main or critical fire doors, if you want to categorize them, but they probably aren't checking all of the fire doors. Generally, the HJs don't have time to perform detailed inspections of any system, let alone going through a structure trying to find all the fire doors and perform this level of detailed safety inspection that NFPA 80 requires. That's why either the owner's personnel need to have this training, or third-party inspectors are required to perform this inspection. It's very time-consuming. Now, there are some cases where the label on the door has a specific requirement for hardware application. And you have to be able to read the information on the label and then look at the hardware and make sure there's a match. If there's no match, then there's a problem, and it needs to be resolved. Specifically, fire exit hardware. That's a term that is very specific to a type of panic hardware that is used on fire-rated door assemblies. Aesthetically, they look the same, but internally there are some very remarkable differences in the internal components between panic hardware and fire exit hardware. A temperature rise door, a label on a door that requires temperature rise or has a listing that says 650, 450, or 250 degrees temperature rise. Typically, you're going to see those types of fire doors in a stair tower. And just for those of you who might not be familiar with that term, the lower the degree, the better the protection. 250 degree temperature rise label means that in the first 30 minutes of a fire, the temperature on the non-fire side of the door assembly can only raise 250 degrees above the ambient temperature. So if it was 70 degrees on the non-fire side of the opening, the maximum degrees that it would rise to in the first 30 minutes would be 320 degrees. And the concept is that it protects the non-fire side of the door long enough for the building occupants to move past that door assembly safely on their way to evacuating the building. But again, if that label's covered over, then you don't know which level of temperature rise, if any, is provided by that door. So again, very critical information to have. And just a side note, with the temperature rise doors, there are certain glazing requirements you can't have in a 250 degree door. I think I'm right in saying no glazing is permitted. I'd have to double check that myself, but very little glazing. You wouldn't have a half glass door, for instance, with a temperature rise door. So if you're doing your inspections or you're looking around your own buildings and you see a fire door that says temperature rise, anything 650, 450, or 250, any level of temperature rise, and there's a big piece of glass on that door, there's a problem. Somebody modified that door. So again, it takes that knowledge and expertise to be able to look at what is there and then understand what the door assembly is. Training for HJs, owners, and inspectors. Well, we've got some resources. Now, first thing that you need to understand about NFPA 80 is that it does not require any level of professional certification. It does require that the persons performing the inspections be knowledgeable about the type of door assemblies that they're inspecting. Again, we're talking specifically today about swinging fire doors with builder's hardware. But there are rolling steel fire doors, horizontally sliding fire doors, the other types of fire doors that we mentioned just a few minutes ago. Each one of those types of fire door assemblies have very unique requirements that require skilled, knowledgeable people to evaluate, to make sure that those door assemblies are being properly maintained. Professional certification is one way that the HJ community and the building owners can rely on the abilities of third-party inspectors. So maybe if a building owner has trained personnel doing its own inspections, which is permissible, they might need to show the AHJ that their personnel have the necessary knowledge, or the knowledge necessary to perform these inspections. Certification, again, is a way of documenting that knowledge. So even though NFPA 80 doesn't require it, the HJ community and the building owners might desire it, just to make sure that the people who are performing those inspections know what they need to know and they can rely on that expertise. Now, here you see a list of considerations. We have fire safety, life safety, accessibility, security, and we have access control. Well, those last two kind of go together, security / access control door assemblies. You can have a swinging fire door that is in a location in a building where it has to meet all of these requirements. But that door has to, the number one consideration of any fire door assembly, bar none, is that they have to close completely and latch in place in order to perform their fire protection properties. So maybe, accessibility these days. We have a lot of door openings that people like to see door closers with very light action springs on them, so the doors are easily moved and they're not putting a lot of pressure on people as they move through the door opening. If the door closer doesn't have sufficient power to reliably close and cause that door to latch every time it's opened, then it doesn't work. So in the case of fire door assemblies, typically the fire door requirements take precedence over all other code requirements, even though there's competing arguments that, well, we want accessibility here, we want this, we want that, we want convenience with access-controlled applications. The fire door requirements come first. Everything else then is balanced and adjusted as best it can be. But at the time of fire, those doors have got to be closed and they've got to be positively latched. It's as simple as that. Now, the foundation that we talked about at the beginning, Door Security and Safety Foundation, that's an extension of DHI, the Door and Hardware Institute. And it's a nonprofit corporation. We spend a great deal of time going out, talking to the HJ communities, talking to building owners, letting them know about the need for these fire door inspections, and letting them know that there are some trained people out there that can help perform these inspections. So the work of the foundation is pretty important. Now, the foundation offers several publications that people can buy on demand that help explain the requirements of NFPA 80's inspection requirements. We have a guide for HJs. We have a guide for the owners. We have something called the reference guide, which is just, it'd be impossible to document every possible combination of door frame and hardware condition. But at least it's a starting place. It talks about the most common applications, the most common problems that you might see. And in that reference guide, there's actually a step-by-step procedure for performing that visual inspection that Kristen described, as well as for performing the functional testing of the door openings. So it's kind of a valuable reference guide. That last bullet point, online training coming in 2012, well, I'm pleased to say it's actually here, actually. This is a screenshot from it. This is a tutorial that probably takes about 2 hours for somebody to go through. It is by no means going to train anybody to be a professional fire door assembly inspector, but it is a very good primer, a very good awareness builder type program. For those of you who might be familiar with the Xbox world or the PlayStation world, there are some exercises where you will actually perform some inspections of a couple door assemblies in that type of environment, virtual environment. So it's kind of a neat interactive type program. Now, there is a cost to this, but you'll be receiving an email. Each of you who are on this call will be receiving an email with some follow-up information, and among that there will be a promotional code that will discount the cost of that course should you decide to use it, and also give you directions on how to sign up for it and where to find it and all that good stuff. But just know that it's a neat little program that's out there that might help continue the conversation. Now, the Door and Hardware Institute, who are we? Well, we've been around for a long time. Our roots go back to the 1930s and 40s, and I won't bore you with all of the details, but we are a not-for-profit association, and we have spent over 50 years teaching the industry and people associated with our industry about architectural door openings, specifically swinging fire doors with builder's hardware. We, as part of our membership, the manufacturers are part of the membership. Our primary membership is from the suppliers or the distributors of the components for the swinging fire doors with builder's hardware. But we spend a great deal of time and energy teaching people about the fire codes and life safety codes and accessibility codes that affect a door assembly, teaching them about the product applications and the limitations. So we know swinging fire door assemblies probably better than any other organization out there, and we spend a great deal of time teaching that. Now, specifically when you talk about the DHI training program for fire door assembly inspectors, just when you look at this list of bullet points, understand that this is a really intensive training program, and it is not for the novice. People need to qualify to take this training program. They need to have a certain level of product knowledge and application before they come into this class. Right now, as of today, our program is based on NFPA 80-2007. That will change before next spring. We'll be upgrading it to the 2010 edition. Even though 2013 is coming up, we'll be upgrading it to 2010. You can see we talk about NFPA requirements of NFPA 101, Life Safety Code. Some of you might not know that NFPA 101, the Life Safety Code, has specific inspection requirements for door assemblies, fire rated and non-fire rated, in educational occupancies, assembly occupancies, daycare occupancies, and residential board and care occupancies. So there are other inspection requirements that the inspectors need to know about. We actually walk the students through performing inspections, so they get some mock experience doing the inspections. And we have a proctored 4-hour exam, of which they need to pass the exam with a minimum score of 80% or better. And we've developed a offering of standardized inspection report forms to help record the inspections. Now, Intertek, one of the major testing organizations for the door industry, if not the major testing lab out there, has a certification program for inspectors of fire door assemblies. They use the DHI training program as the benchmark for individuals to enter the Intertek Certified Fire Door Inspector certification. And you can see on here, it would take more time than we have right now to talk about all of the details of the Intertek program, but basically every 3 years the inspectors have to recertify, and that means there's a continuing ed component. They don't need to take the whole class over again every 3 years, but there is a continuing ed component that they need to complete ongoing as long as they want to be certified every 3 years. And they have a photo badge that shows the AHJs or building owners that yes, they are Intertek certified with their expiration date and other important information on their badges. So it's another way of proof, physical proof, that this person has a considerable amount of knowledge when it comes to the world of swinging fire doors with builder's hardware. Now, there are some online directories. If you're looking for somebody who has passed the DHI training or who has gone on to become Intertek certified, here are a couple of links that you can go to find out more about them. Now, I will tell you this. The DHI training program started in 2007, and to date, 270 people have passed the class. And to give you a little bit of context to that, there are literally millions of installed fire doors in the United States and Canada. No one can put an actual number to it. They've never actually been tracked by numbers, and then you have those door assemblies that have been removed, whether they were remodeled or damaged. You've got buildings that have been torn down and new buildings built. Nobody knows exactly how many fire door assemblies are out there, but we know it's millions. It's going to take a few more than 270 people to perform all of these inspections. But owners, personnel can be trained to do these inspections. More third-party inspectors can be trained. It's going to take time. AHJs need to know that there is a source for performing these inspections before they can turn the switch on and say, hey, come do these inspections. So it's a slow startup period. We're 5 years into it. It might be another 5 or more years before these inspections become more commonplace. The one thing that you should be aware of, those of you who might be representing building owners today, the one thing that you might want to think about is that right now, if inspections of fire door assemblies are not required in your area, you have a grace period. You have time to bring your door assemblies into compliance gradually, and understand that to mean less expensively than waiting for the HJs in your area to decide, to activate these inspections and begin enforcing them, where you will have much less time, and then you're going to be struggling finding money in the budgets to make these corrections, because it will no longer be optional at that point. So those of you who are representing building owners, now's the best time to start making this plan. It's a lot like you'll recall back in the early 90s when we had the Americans with Disabilities Act go into play. It took years for those requirements to be applicable to all types of buildings open to the public, but it got there eventually. The same with NFPA 80's inspection requirements. It will become part of the normal course of business at some point in time. Now's your only time to make a plan to gradually bring it into compliance. Now, we just have 10 minutes, so I've got to really look here. We've got a couple slides here that I want to show you. Fortunately, a lot of the corrective actions that are necessary require very little expense. Tightening fasteners, maybe replacing fasteners. Some things you need to know: that Builders Hardware products have some special fasteners. You can't just run out to Home Depot or Lowe's and buy some replacement bolts and screws and put them in and expect them to work. They have some very special types of fasteners that are unique to them. Filling unused fastener holes. It can be as simple as installing a steel or stainless steel screw. Or maybe some joint compounded wooden dowel pins in wooden fire doors. There are some new products coming on board, that caulking products that can be used to patch some types of fire doors. And they're brand new. I mean, this year, just within the last couple of months, brand new. Kristen mentioned shimming of hinges. And just replacing small parts like strike plates or covers or end caps, just little things that don't necessarily cost a lot of money. Now, one thing that you need to understand is that swinging doors with Builders Hardware are mechanical devices. It's not a question of will they wear out, it's only when will they wear out. And depending on where they are located in the building, for instance, here's a quick little chart. And I'm not going to go over all of these details. Again, hopefully you've got the handouts printed out, but you can begin to envision how many times some door assemblies operate on a daily basis and on an annual basis. And you can see even the best product, let's say for the sake of discussion, you have a hinge that is designed to operate for 2 million cycles. Depending on where that hinge is installed, that might have a lifetime cycle, or it might have a cycle of just a couple years. It really depends on where these products are installed as to what their expected lifetime is going to be. And then there are also better products. There are good, better, and best products. And sometimes the better products are more expensive, frequently they are, but they also will last longer through the life of the building. So sometimes that initial expense is well worth the investment if it means replacing it less times going forward in the future. Okay, we have some pictures to show you, and then we'll be closing up here. So I'm going to go through these pictures relatively quickly here. This is a picture of a pair of doors, and at first, it looks like it's in relatively good repair. But you begin to see, at the meeting styles of the doors where they come together, there's a little bit of a heavy line there, a little shadow. You don't know what's going on. The next couple pictures kind of give us a better understanding of this particular door. This particular door, Kristen showed this a little bit earlier. It's missing a screw. A relatively easy fix to do, provided you have the right fastener. Here we see that that same pair of doors isn't latched. You can see the latch bolt hanging up. You can see that the doors are not properly aligned. Something is preventing that door from closing all the way. Here, same pair of doors, the inactive leaf. This cutout that's empty is for a flush bolt to latch the bottom of the door to the floor. We don't know if there's a strike there. We can't see. We don't know if there's a strike there. But it's obviously missing. That was one pair of doors. This is another pair of doors. And because of the way these doors are painted, you can see that even at this distance, there are several problems with this particular door. You can see at the very bottom, the white line between the two door leaves is very small. And you can see at the top, it's very large. Those doors are out of alignment. And it's probably the frames out of alignment, not the doors aren't bent. It's probably the frame legs are out of alignment. You can see that in the upper left-hand corner, the door closer is at least missing its cover, which, while it might not be a critical item, is certainly something that's required to be there. Again, we have another missing fastener on this door. Here, this is the same pair of doors that we're looking at. We can see where there are screw holes that were intended to mount the latch case, the bottom latch case of those Panic or fire exit hardware devices. You can also see in the floor there are no strikes. So the flooring was replaced most likely. The strikes were removed. Somebody took the bottom latches and bottom rods off of these fire exit hardware devices. Now here, this picture doesn't necessarily show us a deficiency, although it's something to be concerned with. We see some rusting here. Now, as long as there's no rust through on a steel door, we're okay. But this would be something to watch, and especially if that seam is coming apart. See at the top of the picture, if that seam is spreading apart and it's flexing, then that door is broken. There's something broken in the edge of that door. And it might be repairable, taken back to a shop and repaired, but it might be justification for replacing that particular door if it really is broken. Here we have one of the latch assemblies, and you can see obviously that the latch assembly is not attached to, it's not secured to the back plate attached to the door, so it's not properly installed. Probably an easy fix. You can see that there's this bottom screw is missing from the latch assembly, and if you pay very, very close attention, the strike plate that's mounted in the frame above the latch assembly, look at the fasteners. The one on the right is a Phillips head fastener, which is almost, I can assure you, almost certainly an original fastener. The slotted fastener in the front on the left is not an original fastener. So that's a problem. Same here, we have, these are the upper vertical rods, but if you look at the fasteners, you have three different fasteners there. The Phillips head fastener on the left is probably the original. The one on the right, just to the right of that first Phillips head fastener, is probably not, and the two slotted ones are not. So those are not original fasteners either. So again, it takes a trained eye to spot these things, and you really can't catch all of this without really knowing what you're looking for. Now, this is the door closer that was missing its cover. More important than the cover missing, though, we can see the darkened area around the spindle and the glistening in the light. That's indicating that the fluid is leaking out of that door closer. So another subtle but certainly important deficiency. When a closer loses its fluid, it loses the ability to control the door. So instead of closing gradually, it'll close very quickly under that spring power. It'll begin to slam, and when the door leaf slams the frame, it will knock the frame loose. It becomes creates other problems. This particular slide is not part of that door assembly we just looked at. This is another door assembly altogether, and we're really showing you this to show you the label that says Fire Exit Hardware. This is a panic device that is also Fire Exit Hardware because it has the label Fire Exit Hardware on it. Somewhere on your Fire Exit Hardware will be a label of similar design. Okay, and I'm going to turn it back over to Kristen right now. Sorry, Kristen, I ran long.
No, that's no problem. I'm just going to cover this very quickly, Keith. That way you can get the little blurb in there about the LinkedIn piece as well. So just very quickly, in about 30 or 60 seconds, I just wanted to give everyone sort of a heads up on where the next edition of the standard is going. Like I said earlier on in the program, believe it or not, the 2013 edition of NFPA 80 is complete. It will be available for purchase, through NFPA, probably within the next 3 to 4 weeks or so. Now, again, this particular edition is not going to be referenced by things like NFPA 101 or Life Safety Code until that 2015 edition. So it's going to be a little while until we see some of the, requirements here, really be enforced. But it's important to know sort of where we're going with this document and what to look for when you do use the 2013. In particular, one of the biggest changes is in direct relation to everything we've been talking about today, and that is with Chapter 5. The committee has done sort of a full reorganization of the chapter, really just after having Chapter 5 be new for 2 editions of the document, 2007, 2010, the committee kind of looked at it and said, we can make it even better. So what you'll see is a reorganization editorially of how the different topics are presented, some clarification on field modifications and sort of their applicability. As far as technical changes, one of the most significant changes is with regards to record retention. We've added some significant detail on providing records, how you retain those records, how long the records must be retained for, what information the records must have, the documentation for inspection and testing and maintenance. We've sort of detailed and sort of defined the difference between acceptance testing and periodic testing. We have, for 2013, mandated that these inspections be completed by a qualified person. And a qualified person is defined in Chapter 3 of NFPA 80, and that could mean someone that has some sort of formal certification. So because this annual inspection requirement, again, it was new in 2007, the community is still getting used to it. It's not practical to mandate specific qualifications or training for a person when a new requirement comes out, because there wouldn't be anyone that met those requirements. However, for 2013, we have kind of made that a little bit more restrictive to make sure that the people or the groups that are doing these inspections do have some specific qualifications to them. We've also provided, or the committee has provided, some excellent annex language, some supplemental language for many of the issues in Chapter 5 that are going to help out with some of the inspection, testing, and maintenance issues. Outside of inspection, testing, and maintenance, we've provided some additional definitions, some new language on installation of fusible links in sleeves, new language on continuous hinges and pivots on sill construction, and again, some really helpful language in the annex of the document to give some guidance on some of these new requirements that we have put in there. But definitely look for sort of a reorganization of Chapter 5. Almost everything that Keith and I have talked about today is still there. The numbering might be a little bit different, but we've really made it more user-friendly, more comprehensive, and better for all of those 3 audiences that we've talked about throughout our program today. In our very last slide, or a couple of slides, I'll hand back over to Keith.
All right. All right, thank you. Thank you all for taking time. I know we're running a couple minutes longer. If you can hang with me just for a couple minutes, we'll finish this up. What you see on the slide here, on your screen here, DHI has an annual convention, and our convention's coming up in August, or rather in October, 17th and 18th in Las Vegas. Any of you who are in the area that might like to come and check out more about the Door and Hardware Institute, you're welcome to come. If you are an AHJ or if you are an architect, you can actually have a complimentary registration to the trade show for the event. You've got to cover your travel and expenses and lodging expenses and everything, obviously. But if you want to come to the trade show, you can do so. You just need to present a business card or something on letterhead that documents who you are and your position, and we can give you a complimentary registration to the trade show. So if you're in the area and have an interest in it, by all means, you're more than welcome. And I know that you have a lot of questions about today's topic and things we probably haven't even had time to talk about necessarily. Here is a screenshot of the LinkedIn group. It's simply called the Door and Hardware Institute's Fire Door Assembly Inspection Group. You don't have to be a member of DHI. In fact, the majority of, we have about 600 members right now in this group, and the majority of them are not door and hardware industry people. They are HJs, building owners of and such, architects, and we have a very good discussion about fire door assembly, just fire door assemblies in general. So if you have an interest, you're more than welcome to come over, sign in, and join the discussion, and we can address your questions there. And again, thank you. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for sticking with us. I know we ran a little long. Good day.
Thank you, Keith and Kristen. If all of you could stay here for just a few more minutes, I will walk you through some information that will be very helpful once you depart. Your continuing education unit certificates will be emailed to you within 5 business days. The recording and handout will be available on our informational page of the NFPA 80 code at www.nfpa.org/80 in about 10 days. If you would like to check out the schedule of the upcoming webinars, please check out catalog at the nfpa.webinars.org. Any further questions, please feel free to email them directly to webinars@nfpa.org. We would like to thank our sponsors, DHI and Door Security and Safety Foundation. Please make sure to visit their website at www.dhi.org or www.doorsecurity.safety.org. On behalf of the National Fire Protection Association, DHI, Door Security and Safety Foundation, Keith, Kristen, and myself, we'd like to thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your day.